So Sophia already gave me a very kind introduction, so I won't talk about my work stuff. But I'm also a teacher on the side at a place called the School of Visual Concepts. It's actually secretly my favorite job. I teach design and research to students and adults transitioning into UX, as well as we are the school that teaches the Amazon UX design and research apprentices, which is incredible. So that's really cool to be a part of too. I'm also a sewist and a cat mom, just to tell you a little bit about who I am outside. I've also met Andrea's cat, Dexter, who's currently making a cameo. And this is my cat, Mara, just like full on enjoying the windowsill in September. So that's just a little bit about me. I wanted to get like slightly Shakespearean and tell you what is going to happen before it actually happens. And I know part of the purpose of this chat is really to give you practical advice. So you have all of this amazing OOUX knowledge from workshops, from podcasts, from articles, and now we want to talk a little bit about how to take that to the next level, which is not just having that OOUX experience exist within yourself, but really bringing in your teammates' perspectives and their brain power so that they can go along with you in that process. So I'll talk just a little bit about the three topics or tactics that I found that have worked well for me. And again, I'd love to hear tactics that worked well for you as well. So the first one is individualizing. This is once you're like jazzed about OOUX, you're ready to start talking to people about it. And the goal here is just like to convince them to attend their first OOUX workshop. So we'll talk a little bit about things and advice and tactics to do there. The next one is introduce. So now that folks are bought into attending an OOUX workshop, how do you then go about introducing the activities and the methodology to them in the most effective way possible? And then finally, once you've done those OOUX activities, how do you then integrate it and sort of weave OOUX into future touch points that you have with stakeholders? So this is kind of a super methodical approach to sort of get buy-in and help OOUX stick at your organization. Okay, so let's talk about that first step. This is individualized. So here we're making OOUX as approachable as possible. And each of these sections has like a key question to keep in mind. And here it's really how might you make OOUX feel human? So I wanted to mention a couple of different things here. The first is that OOUX is like design technical. This is something that Sophia and I talked about a few months ago, and I think it's really important to keep in mind and can really change the way that you message OOUX to other folks, especially non-designers. So what I mean by design technical is that this is very complex and nitty-gritty. There's a lot of steps involved and a lot of detail involved, and a lot to learn as a result. So if you think about like a database schema or the way that you, I was going to say phrase a SQL query, that's like developer technical, and that takes some sort of cognitive load to understand. And in the same way, this is kind of like our SQL phrases for design, if you will. So think about how you might translate some of the steps into a language that best suits your stakeholders. And that leads us into the next sort of idea here, which is taking this in kind of two steps. So first, talking about OOUX as something human. So taking a bigger context around why OOUX is important and how it fits into our day-to-day lives. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. And then translate it into something that resonates with the individual stakeholder. So perhaps engineers will really like OOUX because it helps them form the back end and the way that they name things, the database, et cetera. And then finally, thinking about convincing people to attend their first OOUX workshop here, it's, I think, really important to figure out where you need active participation versus passive participation. So one of the really nice things about OOUX is that you don't have to do everything or everything at once. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next step. But if there are spots where you really need like your product manager or your engineering manager to actively participate, you can communicate that and make it approachable because you're not requiring them to come along with you throughout the entire journey. Okay, so I wanted to first or next give an example of what I mean by making OOUX human first and foremost. So I absolutely love this graphic. It's spread across 2 slides. It's from content by Everil Yankee. It's also used by Think Company. And she describes this really amazing way of thinking about OOUX, which is essentially people don't think in actions. So often we will create websites based on like add to cart or something like that. And she says here, like, this is not at all aligned to the way that we just think as human beings. So I don't wake up in the morning and say like, all right, what all do I have to wash today? Like, when is my wash period when I'm going to like wash the car, then the dog, then my child? Or I'm not going to go into the brush period next, which I just find like incredibly amusing. But this is like such a beautiful representation of how foreign that would be in real life. So people don't think in actions, they instead think in objects. So here I'm looking at my the things that are important to me, my child, my dog, my hair apparently is also important to me, but I don't really have any anymore. So here, instead of thinking of actions, I think about the objects that are important to me and then the different things that they need. So I always introduce OOUX this way in my company because I think it provides a really compelling reason why OOUX and the way that we think about just designs and experiences in general should be object oriented rather than action oriented. So that's first, like making it human and making it really clear what OOUX is in a very short example. And then I wanted to also mention a part of individualizing. And so we've made it human, and now we want to translate it to what's resonating and relevant to our individual stakeholders. Here, another key question is essentially, how might I make OOUX feel as relevant as possible to the work that engineers are doing or the product managers are doing? And how might I make it critical to the success of the product? So I wanted to just mention a little bit of a case study here. Unfortunately, I can't share the designs, but essentially there was this opportunity to really emphasize OOUX as it informed our key user journeys. And so I really wanted to tie this methodology to something that people already understood. So in the company where I used to work, one of our key user journeys was essentially like an IT administrator needs to understand why a user was blocked from a 2-factor authentication attempt. And so what I did in this sort of presentation about OOUX and why it was important was take that key user journey. And that unfortunately spanned like no fewer than 7 different screens in the product. And this was like our key journey. And so I illustrated sort of the different ways that the IT administrator had to pogo stick around, and then contrasted that with like an OOUX approach where we connect the user and the security policy objects that sort of define why someone is blocked in one page, and use that as a way to really visually emphasize why this could make the design and the experience as a whole better. And so that was really tying not only OOUX to my own work as a designer, but tying it to the success of the product. So if our IT administrator can't do their key thing, then unfortunately the experience is a bit broken. Okay, so we have now gone through the individualizing phase. We've convinced people to attend their first OOUX workshop. And so what we'll move on next is introducing. So here, what I want to emphasize is starting with bite-sized pieces and kind of piquing interest that way. So the key question to keep in mind is, how might you make OOUX feel effortless? Getting involved and being active in the process should feel easy and fun and exciting and impactful. So I wanted to start by just talking about identifying the key pieces that apply to your project. So I think one of the beautiful things about how Sophia set up OOUX is that it's not something that you have to follow like all the way through exactly in the order as defined. Like you can be flexible and choose things that are relevant to what you need at the time. So much in the same way that we like learn a UX process in school, and that never happens in real life. Not to say that OOUX never happens in the way that it's written, but we can take that same spirit and sort of pick and choose exactly what is relevant, and then potentially rewrite that in our own language so that we can further translate that to the context of our work. Next, I really recommend breaking down a workshop into smaller segments. So it can be, and I'll show an example of this in just a second, but it can be super intimidating to see a 4-hour remote workshop on your calendar or an 8-hour remote workshop. And I think given just how challenging it is to have remote things in general, it's really helpful to sort of break those up into smaller pieces during the day. So again, we're trying to understand how we can make OOUX feel effortless. So if you see a 1-hour meeting on your calendar over a few days, as opposed to one large chunk, that makes it a lot more approachable and potentially easier to attend, hopefully. Because you're breaking things up, it's really crucial to sort of reiterate at the beginning of each day what you've done, why you're doing it, and how it informs the next step in the process, so that folks can sort of boot up together and quickly, so you can hit the ground running. And then finally, treat each session as not only an opportunity to do awesome design work with other folks, but as an opportunity to learn together and market OOUX to your organization. So here, really emphasizing sort of how you're learning together, how it's impacting the design strategy already, and how it will make the design process easier. That this is just an amazing opportunity to continue doing that. And this piece of advice will show up, will show up along the way as well. All right, so just a couple of examples. In this case, this is an example of sort of translating the OOUX process into something that's relevant for your project. So what works for my particular style is like documents. So I make a lot of documents. And here I took the time to sort of, I had the opportunity to attend Sophia's workshop. She came to our company and talked to us. So I like unpacked all of that. I then wrote down all of the steps that I thought were relevant, and then how that directly tied to my project. And here kind of translated it and started to morph it into something that would be relevant for a workshop. And then I was able to pick out exactly who needed to be at each step, what I could do by myself, and then where I needed that active participation from my stakeholders. And then I do want to mention, there's something to be said about this amount of planning. I'm not suggesting that everyone should write an intense document about their workshop, but when I shared this with stakeholders, they were able to see that there were things that came before what we were working on. There were things that would come after. There was a lot of planning and sort of systematic activities that would inform what we were doing. So although we had several days where we were working on this, it all sort of culminated in something important. I don't think they read this document, but of course, if they took a look at it, they could see like, oh, Kristen planned this, great. That's really all I'm going for in my work in general. And then here's an example of potentially how to break up an ORCA process or an ORCA workshop. Here, it's just 1-hour sessions in the morning where key stakeholders attended. It would be so amazing if they all perfectly aligned to 1-hour segments, but we had a team agreement in the beginning that if we needed some extra time to discuss, we could set up an hour in the afternoon or something like that, which we did have to do. But again, seeing like these 1-hour segments is a lot more approachable on your calendar than a larger block together, potentially. Okay, so that was the second point. Now you've had your OOUX workshop, you're like jamming, you've done some activities, and your stakeholders are starting to learn OOUX. The next thing that I want to talk about is now integrating it. So how do you continue to make OOUX relevant in your work and memorable for your stakeholders? So here, the key question is really, how can you make OOUX stick? I wanted to mention it's sometimes really hard to remember concepts that are taught one time. So even though your stakeholders have attended this like really cool multi-day thing, they still might not remember everything that goes into OOUX. And so here, I wanted to mention like at each, this is something that has worked for me. At each relevant design share, sort of re-walking stakeholders through OOUX. That's not to say that you have to sort of like rehash everything that you've done, but really succinctly saying like what OOUX is, why it's important, maybe your core objects, and then how OOUX informed your designs that you're looking at today. That can help to make it stick even more. And of course, audiences vary at design shares or research shares. There might be someone who didn't attend the workshop who's now looking at your designs, and you can emphasize what informed what they're looking at today. But then also attention span vary. So people may be paying attention more in some sessions than others. And so really kind of using that like consistent messaging can help to make it stick even more and have it be a further learning opportunity. And then I also wanted to recommend sort of presenting content in a way that suits a variety of learning styles. This is not like true to just OOUX, but I think giving examples that are not only like local context, so specific to your individual product, but also global context. So that illustration of like all of the things I have to brush as a way to make it stick and memorable, but then also providing like visual examples, auditory examples, or both of them as like what we're doing right now. But then also like kinesthetic, if folks can like get their hands on some of the work or actively contribute in that kind of way as well. That can further sort of emphasize and help folks remember it. And then we saw this before, but continuing to think of this as a learning opportunity for your stakeholders, as well as a marketing opportunity. So really it's just weaving OOUX into the fiber of your design and research process and emphasizing how it informs designs. And I'm like not biased or anything, but I think that OOUX super makes the design process much easier because of all of the upfront work and collaboration and agreement. So I'm always talking about it in my design processes as well. And then hopefully you can make it that much more salient at your company as a whole. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. I know we had just some time for some sort of probing questions or any questions that y'all have for me, or tactics that have worked really well for you. I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen. Yay, thank you. I've got quite a few questions. If you want to pull your screen down so we can see everybody again.
Yeah, totally.
So go ahead. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. And meanwhile, I will be asking a few questions. My first question is, how do you determine the scope of what to tackle, especially if you are doing 4 1-hour blocks? Those are pretty tight time blocks. I mean, as anybody who's trying to do this knows, like you could easily, like this could spill into like 8 hours, 16 hours, a couple of weeks of doing this type of work. How do you know the right amount of scope to bite off for like one of those kind of introductory series of workshops?
Yeah, absolutely. I think breaking it down by feature where it makes sense can be helpful. So the theme is definitely like as bite-sized as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So for the workshop that I started with our stakeholders, it was one sort of feature that cut across the entire product. So we could get a look at the objects across everything, but we were able to sort of de-scope everything and just focus on this one sort of area. I also wanted to mention it can provide a really nice snowball effect. So if you feel like, oh, we're just tackling this one thing, but there's so much else over here that we should do, or over here. If you start with something small, that can help you get like I was going to say an army, or like a group of stakeholders that know the process and have gone along with you. So the next time that you tackle the next thing or the bigger scope, you don't have to spend all of that time sort of learning together. You can hit the ground running faster. So I think being very, very judicious about what you start with, and then showing people what comes out of it and hopefully building enthusiasm, and then taking on like a smaller or slowly taking on more and more scope from there can be really great.
Yeah, I think that's probably, I tend to want to tackle the whole thing. I want to take the biggest scope, or even think like, what are those macro objects, and then break it down. It's interesting. Like OOUX is a very like inside out, bottom up approach, but I still tend to want to like tackle the whole thing and get like that big holistic view and then break it down. And I can see it working so much better if you're in a big organization looking to get buy-in by starting with just, one feature. I did it at one of my clients. It was the first time I'd actually ever done it. We OOUX'd one page, just a page. And then did that thing where we're like, oh, well, if we change this on this page, alerts show up over here as well. So then we'll want to probably think about this page, but it was a really good way to get started. So Yeah, I know that like in my teaching, a lot of the time I think like, oh, think of it as wide a scope as possible. But yeah, taking that feature and then that helps you kind of connect it in context to potentially like other features. And then you can start gluing them together.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. If anybody else has a question, feel free to go on mute, off mute, or put it in the chat. I've got plenty more. I'll just keep going. Okay. Time boxing. So my other question is on time boxing. So well, it's kind of a weird technical question. I did see that you had it from 11 or 10 to 11:05. Why? Why 11:05?
That's so people don't get booked with meetings right after it and have to leave earlier, anything like that. That's like a sneaky thing.
I saw that. Yeah. Yep. Cool. So what happens if you don't feel like you're done? Like, let's say you got really nice on objects, like, and are you breaking it down between objects, relationships, CTAs, and attributes? Those were the 4 sessions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, what if you don't feel done with relationships? Do you still move on? Do you just like time box it and you move on to the R of the ORCA process?
Yeah. So the way that we set up this workshop, I think I'm like such a huge fan of team agreements before jumping into a huge amount of work, like doing an ORCA workshop. So as part of our team agreements, we were like, all right, if we don't finish a step, let's book an hour in the afternoon if we need to. And then if we haven't finished it by then, we can potentially add another session, but let's like be ruthlessly, have like a ruthless bias towards action, so to speak, so we can just keep moving through and iterate. So I think there was a spirit of like knowing like, okay, we have to keep doing this. It's only 1 more hour. We have the whole rest of the day that we could slot it in. But then like, let's keep moving forward and know after this ORCA workshop is done, we can still iterate on this in the design phase, which we actually did. And it worked pretty well.
That's awesome. Very cool. What percentage of that hour is teaching versus doing?
Ooh, that's a really good question because I always try and sneak in like extra teaching, but it was only like 15% of the time because I think what worked really well were the templates that you shared in the OOUX workshop or teaching session for our company. So I was able to just pull those down with like examples and show flows and things like that. So we could speak to like very micro teaching at the beginning of each step within like the O or the R or the C or the A. And yeah, I was just able to like hit the ground running and speak to it very fast before we jumped in.
So like maybe 15 minutes, if that, of that hour would be spent teaching. And then you're kind of coaching as you go through and course correcting for folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing, so Lisa has a question. Any big picture yeah, Lisa, I know you were like, you want to just go off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, sure. So I was just wondering if you had any big picture tips for how to initially explain the concept to stakeholders where you're kind of selling them. I know you might've gone into this, but just to help them see the value, because if you go into too many details, they just, that's not going to work well. So yeah, any big picture tips there?
Yeah, I will never hesitate to show this image again because it is truly my favorite image. I don't think this immediately answers your question, but I'll tell it in 2 parts, which is like first explaining OOUX. Were you here for this part before I jump into this again?
No.
Okay.
Sorry, I did re-explain.
That's okay. I love talking about this. I'm totally fine. So first is just like explaining OOUX as a concept that is just like connected to the way that we as humans perceive things. So in this example, we don't think in actions. So y'all are just going to hear the same thing again. And
no, it's okay. You don't even have to go into it now. Just seeing that this is how you're seeing the visual. And this is kind of in a way how I think about it too, helping them understand actions.
Yeah.
So then go ahead and show the next slide too. I think like Lisa will totally connect the dots just seeing that. And this is similar to like the coffee shop example that I give of like, oh, you walk into a coffee shop. What are you going to like, you're just going to start identifying what the things are. If you can't figure out what the things are, you're not going to know how to act.
Right.
But I think that this is a really great visual.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And I can see, I like the showing a visual instead of just verbally trying to explain things. I think that could, I haven't been doing that. I think that could be really useful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And I wanted to
yeah.
mention too, once you've sort of established like a global, like human picture of what OOUX is, I think it's really helpful to back that up with something that's very specific to your product or service. So I gave the example of like comparing this really broken key user journey as it exists today to what it could look like if we surfaced the relationships between objects and made it really easy to connect the dots. But I think Sophia has some really amazing examples of where OOUX, like what happens if you don't do OOUX. And so even just taking the time to pick out one meaningful example and showing what it could look like with OOUX can be like that, all that you need to kind of hammer it home, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah. Shapeshifters, all like, that's what my go-to is Shapeshifters, to like do a shapeshifter audit. So for those here that don't know what a shapeshifter is, it's basically an object that's represented differently across different screens. So Meetup is one of my favorites to pick on. Go do a shapeshifter audit on Meetup and go do some screenshots of all the different ways an event is represented. It's crazy. You'll find like 5 different ways, and just even like timestamps moving around. It's all arbitrary. There's no good, like sometimes you want to have things represented differently in different places. But in general, you don't want that to be arbitrary changes. You want that to be really meaningful changes. And you want to remember that you're sacrificing consistency if you're changing things around. And that is really good for people who are holding purse strings to see that, because you can show us some screenshots of like 5 versions of the thing and say, we could have had one version that would work in all of these places. And if we'd been thinking this way, then not only would we have made it easier for the user because they have less to learn, it would have been easier for us. Like we designed 5 things and we could have designed one thing. And then our developers had to develop those 5 things. And now from a QA perspective, often that's going to be an issue as well, and maintenance. So that's another just good, like visceral way to show people.
Okay. Yep. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Anybody, this is actually for anybody that wants to talk about this, but Kristen, I'll point my question to you first. What about fitting it into an agile process? Anything like we're just supposed to sketch on a whiteboard and then go into develop, and maybe make some user stories, make some quick sketches, and then we're supposed to go start developing it. How do you mitigate that?
Yeah, I have thoughts on this, but I would love to hear if anyone else has something that they want to jump in.
Or anybody that just even wants to vent, who's trying to do this in an agile environment?
I mean, yeah, this happens a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Lisa. And I'm just going to say that Ellis was proposing that question about feature specific, because part of agile, of like figuring out what the features are. Sometimes you can do the user backlog, and then so moving forward with that. So would it be like noun feature specific, or like how would you implement that? I'm just giving a little nudge to Ellis's question because it's kind of along the lines of features and agile and all that stuff. So.
I mean, I'll speak a little bit to this. Like, I think, and it's just hard for me to answer because I haven't been internal on a team in so long. But just consulting and like flying through and being like, all right, good luck with that. Good luck with that object map. But theoretically, in my mind, and I'd like to hear what y'all think about this, is basically through the CTA matrix, making those object-oriented user stories. So you figure out your objects, maybe at the feature level, and then figure out, okay, what do users want to do to those objects? Those might have come from some like hacked together user stories, but then you put them in the CTA matrix, you get really clear on the why is somebody doing this, in what context are they doing it, And you basically end up with the pieces of a user story that you could write it out into like an agile format of a user story. But it's just making sure that that the action of your user story is connected directly to an object. Sometimes there's multiple objects in there, but it's very clear what is the user doing the thing to.
Yeah, there's something that I picked up on that. I think it was in a podcast that I was listening to, or a video. And it was kind of, you've defined some nouns or objects, and you've got a list of the things and you've got a list of things that you haven't quite nailed down, but then you're able to go ahead and start iterating on the things you do know and get them launched, released, update them, and then go back to the other thing that you haven't properly defined yet. You can prioritize those things and, and then just kind of put them more into like a sprint type of cadence.
Yeah, 100. I mean, the prioritization piece is like, I think that's one of the reasons that so many of our products are kludgy, is because we don't create that like solid foundation of what to build first, that then we can build upon it and iterating. If we're iterating on, like we launch with those like the object that we're the most clear on. And then we've created a list of backlog of questions that we can go back to research on to be like, I don't really know if this thing is an object, or like, do people really want a message object within this system? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe we don't really need to build the whole messaging feature, which means the message object, right? Into this system, but let's build these things that we do know we need first, get them really nice and connected. And maybe they're like a really super simple iteration of that object. Like maybe we talk about prioritizing. If we have an object map, we can prioritize by object. You can kind of draw a vertical line and say like, all these other objects are for later. And then we can draw sort of, if we prioritized our attributes, put the most important attributes at the top, then we can draw sort of like a jaggedy horizontal line. And we're basically cinching in our object map and kind of honing in on like, okay, this is what we're building first. And then we can create some, basically a backlog. like here, in this sprint, let's build out like all the stuff that we didn't get into this object. Let's get like all these other pieces of metadata and core content and get this in, or this additional call to action.
I wanted to ladder off of that and add one thing, which is sprint zero. So that can be super helpful to have the time to do the OOUX activities that are needed for whatever feature or epic you're focusing on, and having the opportunity to bring the developers into that as well. Sprint zeros don't always exist in the way that Agile exists in real life, but it's always nice to advocate for and use when you have it.
Advocate for a double sprint zero if you can. I'm a fan of the double sprint zero.
I have one thing I'll add to that too, because I've been like thinking about this. So I've been working on some software that has already been developed. It's a little OOUX-y, like you kind of can see some objects, but not truly. It's not like a real, like really built in that way, but we needed to add shifts to it. And so I just thought, okay, this really does need to be an object. It's a thing, it's a repeated thing that is tied to multiple things in the system. So although the whole system's not that way, I'm starting to slowly kind of try to make the software that way. So, okay, this shift is an object. So I'm going to put that in the navigation, and people can see that real easily, and they can see what it's tied to, and it will show up on those other screens. So it's kind of like slowly integrating it, but that will be its own whole, like kind of part of the Agile process, right? But it's just going to be an object that we're starting to incorporate. But I found that it kind of works to just slowly start integrating over time. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Like, it doesn't have to be this, like, you don't have to start with a full redesign and like create, you don't necessarily have to have, like, ideally, you have this like really solid foundation of OOUX structure. And then you're like upgrading your objects or like gracefully rolling in a new object. You might not have that. You might have a big old mess that you're adding something to, but what you add into it can have the spirit of OOUX to it.
It's sprinkled in.
Yeah. For sure.
But I think slowly over time, it can kind of start to build. It can start to make a difference, because Agile is going to always keep developing, always keep changing and improving. And it might change things for what be like a pain for users to have to like learn new stuff. But I mean, that happens sometimes. But yeah, I found that it's working okay to do that. Yeah.
Awesome. We only have a few more minutes left, but I kind of want to pose a question to the group. We just talked about Agile, but I kind of want to go back to the scoping question. That's a question that I get a whole lot. I'm wondering if anybody else has any thoughts on this, on like how to, especially if you're going to be teaching, like what Kristen was talking about was like teaching and like actually getting stuff done, like moving the ball forward, right? Do you ever, and Kristen, I'm going to kind of look at you, but like, if you're specifically trying to get buy-in, is there additional things that you're thinking about on like, this is going to be a really good challenge for somebody to get started with and do this for the first time?
Can you say the question again at the end there? My brain just.
Like any other ways, like for example, so when I'm thinking about how to get how to create a design challenge, how to like hermetically seal a design challenge, like this is the thing that we're working on right now. I feel like that's one of the hardest things to do in a workshop environment. It really in any product design, like what is the scope? What are we actually trying to design there? Like what are the edges on this thing? It's incredibly difficult. But especially like in a teaching environment, like if you're trying to teach this thing, how do you determine what your scope is?
Teaching to people, like it's just incorporating that as part of what you're doing in order for them to understand.
Yeah, it's like the first time somebody's done it. Like I'm just thinking, well, Kristen, like you were working on really complex abstract stuff. And did that work okay? Or did you like give some examples of things that were maybe a little bit more concrete? Like, for example, so I'm going to be teaching a Udemy course with Joe Natoli, like a really kind of introductory course. Yeah, we're really excited. But we wanted to make a really simple design challenge. So we're doing a Trails app. Like basically read it, like, so it's very like, there's actually like, you can picture those things in the real world. Like it's parks and trails and points of interest. It's like very clear what the objects are for a beginner. But like, if you're in freaking security, 2-factor authentications, like, do you give examples or something? Like, how do you concretize some of those really abstract things, or even a shift, Lisa, like the stuff that you're working on is like complex, I think, B2B software, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I will throw in, I think the more concrete the example can be, and how like concretely it maps to real life, the better. This brings to mind like toothbrush journeys or things that we as humans do like every day a lot. And some of those things are like going to the grocery store, or like paying for gas, or like checking your bank balance. I think having those opportunities where it's like, yeah, like exactly what Ellis just said, like a familiar concept that's part in the real world and part in the digital world, I think can be a really good bridge into something more complicated. So I probably should have used those examples in the security workshop, but I didn't.
But it worked out fine, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think because people, they had the domain knowledge, you know.
So I have another idea. This is not for necessarily as complex of stuff, but one thing I'm going to actually try tomorrow in a workshop so I can report back, but it's actually like having, not really wireframes, but just having a page like in Whimsical or Miro or something like that, just having pages. And then with the clients kind of being more like, for them to understand nested objects and the relationships on the page saying, would you want to see this over here? And then taking it and putting it over there and kind of like creating a visual, you know, with them. So they have something tangible, because I've just found certain clients can't do the conceptual thinking without having a visual, like the relationship map or object map. They just are having a hard time, even if I've tried explaining stuff. So, but I'm going to try that tomorrow. Just having, it's not even really wireframes. It's just kind of like, here's a page. This thing would be a page. What other things need to be on there? And let's list out what would need to be on this page. Just, yeah, so more from a simple thing. When it gets more complex like that too, like the things you're talking about, I think that it's challenging to kind of, it's challenging to kind of get people to understand those things sometimes in general.
Yeah. The nested object matrix, Kristen, do y'all do like when you get into R, like do you actually do a nested object matrix, or do you do like a system model? Like how do you talk about relationships?
We did both actually.
In an hour?
Yeah.
Oh.
We were very motivated. I think it was just to like look at it in two different ways and see which one suited our individual learning styles.
Yeah. Yeah. I still have both of them that I teach and still use both of them, but it's the battle of the sort of the redundant models. Yeah, but it is difficult to like, I kind of like, sometimes we'll say, think about the column as a detail page. And so it's like a very low fidelity detail page. And if I'm on like the thing at the top, if I'm on the person detail page, what other objects do I want to see on that detail page? It's hit or miss. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if you could reverse into it from an existing system. So start with the detail page, map out all the metadata and the objects that are kind of related to that, and then do another one. And maybe that, because hopefully they're familiar with kind of these basic structures of the internet, and maybe that will back them into it as opposed to like blindly pushing them in. Because some people really like to stick to what they know, right? It's a very comfortable space, especially for engineers who have like these database models that they have to like hold in their head. So if you can like start from where it is then, and like, because that's like, when I first got introduced to OUX, it was like 3 or 4 years ago when it was like a couple of articles. So that's all I knew. And we just went from what the existing system had and worked our way out. And like, granted, what we did would horrify anybody today, but we understood the system, and that's how like we sort of came to understand objects. You may get too many objects that way, but as an introductory start, it could be really useful.
I like that. Like just doing kind of just a screenshot of a page and kind of letting people sort of reverse engineer it.
Right. Like in the system that Kristen and I work, like I would start with a user page and then a device page. Mm-hmm. And then we would talk about the relationship between the two, or multiple relationships between the two.
Love this. Yeah.
Yeah, I did that with a group of people, other designers at my job, and we started with something familiar to us. We used Zeppelin for handoff to engineers, and we used their pricing screen because there's plenty of attributes and nested objects in their different pricing levels, and it was interesting to just kind of to kind of challenge them to kind of call out the things that they see there, and then kind of see how they relate or ask questions of, can they have many of them, or is it just one, something like that. And so starting with something familiar and giving them, I guess, provoking people's or participants' curiosity or imagination to create these connections, I find is extremely helpful.
That's awesome. That's a great idea. Yeah. Cool. All right. Hopefully everybody got some good stuff out of today. Please let me know, report back on how this works out. This is a hard part, actually changing minds and hearts. It's tough sometimes, especially if you're working with a team where things have been done a certain way for a really long time to varying levels of success, and you want to kind of change things up. That's tough. So I guess my final words, now, Kristen, I want your final words, but mine are like, be brave and ask for forgiveness, not for permission. Just put the sessions on people's calendars and hopefully they show up.
Yeah, my final words are just make it human and approachable.
Yeah, love it. All right. Y'all have a great night. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. See you next time.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.